Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Kay Thomas, and my pronouns are they and them, and I'm the Clinical Training Manager at North County Lifeline. Before we continue, I'd like to give a content warning, as today's event is a panel discussion with LGBTQ plus survivors of sexual violence. They will be discussing resiliency, healing, and the intersections of their identities as LGBTQ plus survivors. While panelists will not be discussing specifics of their experiences, there may be discussions of sexual violence, mental health, trauma, self-harm, racism, homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. At this time, I would like to welcome our guests who will briefly introduce themselves. Hi, Finn and Sabrina. Hi.
Okay.
Sabrina, would you mind going first? Would you mind sharing your name and your pronouns and any relevant identities or affiliations that you'd like to share?
Yeah, absolutely. So, hi, everyone. My name is Sabrina. My pronouns are she, hers. I am a bisexual, queer, multiracial Filipino American, and I am a survivor of multiple experiences of sexual violence. And professionally, I'm a prevention and community engagement specialist with Center for Community Solutions, which is a dual rape crisis and domestic violence center in San Diego. And I'm also a member of the LGBTQIA+ Survivor Task Force. Super excited to be here today.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. We love Sabrina on our task force. She is a phenomenal individual that does a lot of fantastic education and engagement with our youth track. Finn, would you mind introducing everyone, introducing yourself to everyone, sharing your pronouns and a little bit about your affiliations as well?
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. I'm Finn. I use he, they pronouns. I am a transmasculine queer survivor of a sexual assault. And I am a youth ambassador with San Diego Pride. And I also work with Sabrina and Kay in the LGBTQ Survivor Task Force. I'm with Sabrina on the youth track.
We absolutely love Finn. Finn is fantastic youth ambassador, fantastic advisor to the work that we do. So we are so excited that you are here. Welcome. And I'll give a little bit of additional background about myself. My name is Kay Thomas. Again, my pronouns are they and she. I am a non-binary identifying queer biracial survivor of sexual and relationship violence. I also sit on the LGBTQ plus task force myself. So thank you both so much for being here. I'm really excited for our conversation today. We're going to talk a little bit about a panel discussion addressing some previously submitted questions from folks in the community and folks with our task force as well. And depending on the time we have, we might have a little bit of time to answer some questions from others, from other individuals as well. So let's see here. So the first question is, thinking about kind of yourself when you first started this healing journey, if you could send a message back in time to yourself, what advice would you give to yourself at the beginning of your healing journey?
Yeah, I can start. So I think something that I really needed to hear and wish I could tell myself was that there isn't a right way to feel. You know, I was kind of stuck in like I don't know, like if I should be feeling panic, if I should be feeling like remorse, like what, I just didn't know where I should be. And like, there isn't one way to feel, you know? And I also think I really needed to hear that it's not okay to know what you need. Like if you're stuck in a place of not knowing how to feel, it's really hard to articulate what you might need and want from your support system. I think just knowing that those things were okay would have been really important for me.
Oh, thank you, Finn. I appreciate that, because I think so many times we as survivors feel like we have to forgive, or we have to reach this space of like being okay with things, or like, why am I not more angry about this? Maybe I should be more angry or upset. And so I really appreciate that, because I think there's no one right or wrong way to go through your healing journey. And I think also, like, I really appreciate you saying that, like, I didn't know what I needed. Like, how often do we, especially during the pandemic, like we have people reach out and they're like, hey friend, how can I support you? And you're like, I'm just in my castle of despair screaming into the void. I don't know. So I appreciate you sharing that, because I think that's another thing that many of us are constantly struggling with as well. What about you, Sabrina? What would you have shared with your younger self before you started this journey?
There's a few things. There's so many things, but a few that come to mind are, I wish I could go back and just validate for myself that, yes, Sabrina, you are in crisis. This is what crisis looks like. Because I went months, truly like years, without processing things, without understanding, like, oh no, that was a valid experience, that was a valid trauma experience, right? And so it was a lot of like, well, it wasn't as bad as what I see on TV, it wasn't as bad as what I've heard other people go through, so therefore what right do I have to feel this way? And so I wish I could go back and say, don't spend time like energy comparing your trauma to others, and if you feel those thoughts coming up, then just validate for yourself that your experience is your own and your trauma is valid. Because friend, like, you can't like go without a panic attack when like a garbage truck goes by because it's so loud. That's crisis. And I didn't know that until I finally disclosed to someone who was like, do you need to be connected to a crisis counselor? And I was like, I'm not in is this crisis? Is this what crisis means? So I just wish I could go back and validate all of that, because a lot of time I was disclosing to people who also didn't have the language to describe my experience. And so we all just kind of were like, well, onward. So I wish I could validate. I wish I could remind myself not to compare myself to others. And I wish I could just give myself heads up that healing is not a linear process. Healing is not going to be, I'm never going to get to a point where I'm like, check, done. It's always going to be, it's a mix of good days, struggling days, and that's okay. And that's part of it. And that's fine and normal. It's normal. There's nothing wrong with you.
Oh, Sabrina, I so appreciate that, especially for those of us who grew up in homes that were, for myself, I grew up in a biracial home and in spaces where we have kind of conversations about what healthy emotion looks like between white culture and then like brown or Black culture. And I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think, especially even for myself growing up, there were a lot of times I disclosed things where I was told like, oh, you're being overly emotional or overly dramatic, but really it was a trauma response. It was a crisis response happening in that moment. And nobody was able to acknowledge that that's what was happening because of some cultural biases about behavior and things like that. And so I appreciate you sharing that. And also just like the reality that like, this is not the oppression or trauma Olympics here. Like, everybody is on their own journey. Nobody gets a gold medal for being the most traumatized, because you really, A, don't really want that medal, and B, like, it just doesn't exist. Right. So, I mean, I appreciate that, because I think that's that constant struggle of like, well, mine wasn't as bad. And it's not a matter of like whether it was as bad or not. It's a matter of how it impacted you as the individual. And like you sharing, like, right, if a trash truck is going by and you're having a panic attack, that's an impact, regardless of how big or how small the trauma was. And so I really appreciate you sharing those components, because I think those are some things that just, especially for us as survivors, when we start out, like, we get stuck in those spaces where it's like, you're allowed to have a bad day. You're allowed to like sit down on the side of that journey, of that road, and like take a rest and not focus on healing today, and like just do your thing. Like, it's okay. This is a journey. It's a process. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. Take your time. We're going to be the hare. The tortoise, and we're not going to be the hare. We're going to be like the tortoise. We're going to take our time. But the hare did take, oh, I love the hare flip. Yes, that too. Sorry, y'all, we're getting distracted. All right. So, sorry. Thinking about the next question, what are some resources that you found that have been helpful for you on your healing journey? This could be really any resources, community or otherwise, but what are some things that have been helpful? Sabrina, do you want to start us off with this question?
Yeah. So for me personally, I was connected to my campus survivor support center because a lot of my experiences happened when I was attending college. So shout out to UC Berkeley's Path to Care Center because my advocate there, I didn't know what to expect seeking out support from an agency. And so my advocate there really was there to, just lay out all my options and say, what is it that you want to do next? Because I'm not going to force you to do anything. So these are just the options on the table. And like, where are you interested in exploring? And I didn't know that that's what an advocate did. So really, that was a huge resource for me, a free resource. So a lot of folks aren't aware that a lot of survivor support services are free, depending where you're accessing them. So just a plug for the organization I work for, yes, Center for Community Solutions in San Diego. We provide free confidential support to survivors. So check us out at www.ccssd.org. And aside from, like this sort of like a professional like center to go to, another resource that I think was helpful for healing was just connecting with others who I knew would be able to hold space, because I kind of had feelings about people, like I know that this person in my life probably doesn't have the vocabulary or training or just bandwidth to be able to support me through this, but I know that this other friend does. And I know that this other friend was a resident assistant in the resident halls and had some training about this stuff and could support me. So just identifying the people in my life who were able to be supportive.
I really appreciate that because I think it's so important. Like sometimes like we need different support systems for different things, and we need to be able to lean on different people for different things, and being able to acknowledge like not everyone is going to understand your trauma, and that doesn't make that person any better or worse of a support. It just means they are going to support you differently. And so where can you find those spaces for other people? Like I'm looking in the comments now, and I'm seeing some of our fantastic friends talking about screaming into the void and being like, yep, right. Those are people that I reach out to on a regular basis to be like, oh my God, what's happening? Right. Because they understand where I'm at, and they understand and get me. My parents support me in different ways. My loved ones, my other family members support me in different ways too. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind. Sometimes it's about making sure that we're connecting with the right people ourselves and kind of making that intentional decision to empower ourselves to connect with certain support systems. Finn, what about you? What resources so far have you found that have been helpful for you?
I think for me, some of the most helpful resources have been just like queer community in general, whether that's like friends in my close circle or being a youth ambassador with San Diego Pride, being around other youth and our mentors and our staff. And we have Sabrina and her amazing organization come in frequently to do workshops on consent and healthy relationships, and like just kind of seeing that community and having that space for people to learn more about their experiences. Because, especially being a youth, it's not often brought up. So kind of our perspective is seen, like we see in the media, like dark alley and some stranger, which is very rarely the case, and so being surrounded by community that understands that like being queer has a huge impact on being a survivor, and just having that understanding around me has been super helpful, as well as therapy. And in therapy, my therapist is also queer, which is huge, like being able to talk to somebody on a professional level that fully understands how those identities impact being a survivor has been huge for my healing, for sure.
Yes, Finn, thank you. I think I agree. Like, I think for me, my healing has really been rooted, especially not just my healing from my trauma, but colonialism, capitalism, racism, transphobia, homophobia, biphobia, all of those things too, right? All of those isms, those systemic pieces. I think being in queer space has helped move to I think it's that space of being able to kind of not having to say certain things sometimes, not having to explain all the little details, and being seen and heard, and understanding like the way that queer people often in relationship love each other and even engage with each other, even sexually, is different. And so it's important to be able to be in that space of queer space of recognizing like, this is how my trauma impacts me. And also this is how I live my life as a queer person. And I need other people to help support me through that. And I also really appreciate you mentioning the component of having a queer counselor, because I think that was one of the reasons kind of why this task force started, is we wanted to increase the competency of mental health clinicians out in San Diego who are working with queer survivors. But I think there's something so powerful about having a mental health clinician who gets you and understands that. I know for myself, like 3 years ago, I went to go see a therapist for something related to work, just to process some things and debrief some things. And I went to one session, and the first 30 minutes of the session was this woman grilling me about my sexual orientation and my relationship and my gender identity. And I wasn't even there to talk about those things. I was there to talk about something with work. And so I never even went back to get the support that I needed at that time, because it wasn't competent. It wasn't responsive to my needs. She spent more time asking those questions than what I actually needed. And so I think it's really, really helpful, those moments where we can find those queer mental health clinicians who can step into that space of like, yo, I get it. You don't have to explain to me right now, like, how you're so overstimulated from an auditory processing space. Like, I understand how that relates to your gender as a trans person. That's cool. And that's not something that we always find. So I'm so grateful that you have that, Finn. That is such an important resource. So kind of thinking about resources as well, though, and thinking about like just the reality that like, right, not everybody has access to, actually, I'm going to do a different question. Apologies, I'm getting ahead of myself. The next question I'm going to ask is thinking about your healing experiences kind of as a whole. How have your intersectional identities impacted that? So like whether that's being a queer person or BIPOC, a person of color, maybe that's disabilities or like even economic privilege for you. How have those kind of intersected for you personally? And Finn, do you want to kick us off with this question?
Yeah, sure. So for me, there's definitely pros and cons. I've learned to, especially being queer and being a survivor, a big pro is that people in the queer community tend to understand, because unfortunately, many, many, many queer folks go through this, you know? And so there's always like going into queer spaces, there's always that like base level of understanding that isn't always within like your cisgender heterosexual spaces. So that's huge, just having that like layer of feeling safe with these people. A big con that I've realized is it's sometimes hard, like being trans and having dysphoria, it's sometimes hard to distinguish between whether like looking in the mirror and hating something about like my body or what I see came from trauma or came from being trans, you know? Like it's a totally weird experience thinking about like, okay, like am I seeing this because of like my gender? Am I seeing this because of like what like my abuser has done, you know? And like it's also interesting being queer because it was kind of like one of the reasons I was told that like, hey, this is your fault because this is your sexuality, and like, oh, like we can like prove you wrong, like that's not really like who you are, you know? And so there's just like lots of different like intricacies of healing that are beneficial and really not at the same time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think a lot of folks don't really understand kind of the delicacies of gender dysphoria and how that shows up in those spaces of like, that it's not just about like the way I see myself physically, it's also like tactile sometimes. Like there are things I don't like, I can't touch them, I don't want to be with them. But that's also sometimes part of trauma too, right? Those like implicit memories that are getting activated related to our experiences of trauma, those sensation-based memories. And so it's really, really hard to separate those two out. And it's so important to have that extra support and help, especially from other trans folks who can say like, nope, yeah, I get that too. And you're like, all right, cool. It's my gender dysphoria, right? So it's really helpful sometimes. Sabrina, what about you? What's come up for you kind of exploring your intersectional identities as a survivor in the healing process?
Yeah, so it's interesting, like all the questions, I've seen the questions before, I'm looking through them and just thinking about this particular question, I can feel myself getting activated and like my heart beats a little fast. So please like stay with me as I try to process all the information. I even took notes on what I would want to say, but you know, brain's going everywhere. So, you know, my experience, I always say like, you know, my trauma related to my race or my trauma related to sexual violence, it sits in the same part of my body, you know, because they can't be separated, right? So, you know, as a person of color, as an Asian person, you know, as a bisexual person, as a queer person, my communities have such a just like an overwhelming amount of like hypersexualization in society and media, and just common language. And so when I talk about my experiences with sexual violence, or I try to heal from them, it's not just the individual assaults, right? It's the fact that I was raised with this sort of like life trajectory where it's like, yeah, you see yourself as a sexual object because you've been taught to view yourself that way, or other people use language to describe you that way, and that's just your normal now. So it's been really important for me to connect with other multiracial people, other Asian Americans, other queer people, other bisexual people who also have depression and anxiety. And because we're able to, that feeling that Finn was talking about of just like that kind of safety of just going into a space and knowing like, okay, they get it. It's, there's something healing about being in community, just even if we don't have to name every single experience we've ever had, but just knowing that, I'm not alone in this experience. This experience isn't just, it's mine and mine as individual, but it's shared, right? Because this violence isn't just an individual form of violence, it's the community and societal violence. So yeah, just being able to connect with others, and hold space for each other with this understanding of, this is our experience, it's not our fault, and that's okay.
Sabrina, thank you so much for sharing that. And I really appreciate your vulnerability and sharing components around other intersectional identities like mental health and race. I think it's been, as a biracial individual myself and often white passing, I think there's also this struggle too that comes with understanding how sexual violence and relationship violence is also kind of filtered in with racism and colonization and capitalism, right? And all of these other things that we're struggling with as we're going through healing, and recognizing that we're not just healing from this trauma, this one trauma that happened to us, we're healing as a community, as a larger space. And I think that's one of the things I love about the LGBTQ Survivor Task Force, is that we are creating a community of people who are saying like, we don't go around like, hey, here's what happened to me when I was 12. Here's what happened to me last month, right? Like, we don't go around doing any of that. We spend time in community and creating solutions and creating a space for us to heal, but also for other people to heal as well. And I think those intersectional identities are so important in making that happen, and recognizing all of the different ways that we're impacted by sexual trauma. Especially Sabrina, I think thinking about the work that you do out in the community and constantly out in spaces of prevention and helping engage with the community to keep this from happening in future spaces is so important when we're exploring those intersectional identities as well. So thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate it. So kind of thinking, now I'm going to ask the question I was going to ask before, but I didn't. Sorry. So thinking about like healing and the healing journey in general, of course, especially in the queer community, not everyone has access to insurance or professional care. It is expensive to get professional treatment and healing, and not everybody can afford insurance. And even if they can, Kaiser sucks, y'all. Sometimes your health insurance, like, it's like, okay, I get to go to groups, yay. Or I get to go see somebody for 6 sessions out in this other space. And it's not necessarily enough to address some of the concerns that we have on a regular basis. So I say that to say, for like folks who don't have health insurance, or maybe they can't access professional care on their healing journey as readily, what are some other like practical ways, or maybe other like resources you've found that have been helpful for you? Sabrina.
So yeah, I'll start. So another plug again for CCS, Center for Community Solutions, because I just want to spread awareness that a lot of survivor support centers don't charge, don't ask for insurance, don't ask for documentation or immigration papers, and are confidential. A lot of places are like that, including Center for Community Solutions, www.ccssd.org, and recognizing that organizations, nonprofits often have waiting lists, also often have caps on the amount of sessions you can do, and that's limiting. So that resource is there, and again, it doesn't solve everything. So some things that I found helpful in healing with, because I've sought out professional care and I've sought out healing in other spaces, and that looks different. So for me, part of it was addressing like my individual needs. So intentionally finding out what brings me peace, comfort, and joy, and then seeking those out and doing them on purpose. Because a lot of times when you spend so long trying to get to the next day, you forget that you can find joy, and that there are moments where you find joy and comfort, and that's and so intentionally seeking those out and incorporating those into your day, I found really helpful. I painted these two things when I was having bad days, so there's that. Music has helped, and then we're talking a lot about being in community spaces, and I think that has been really important. Oh, and then one other thing, I talk too much, I apologize, but one other thing is for healing, it's because so much of relationship violence and sexual violence is about a dynamic of power and control, where you don't have the power or control or autonomy over yourself. What I found to be extremely important in healing is, with the people close to me, being very assertive in my boundaries and having this open conversation about, this is what my trauma responses or triggers look like in those moments. This is what I need, or this is what's helpful. I'm not okay with this activity. I'm not okay with this. I don't like it when you do this specific thing. Can you not do that anymore? And just regaining those bits of autonomy by being able to name my boundaries with other people who I know are going to respect that, and having conversations with them about how important it is to me that they do respect that. Because to me, it's not just like, no, I'd rather you not. It's like, it's really important for my safety that you don't do this. And, I'm really lucky that I have people in my life who are willing to learn about boundaries and about consent, and are willing to respect those for me.
Yes, I think, oh my gosh, that's so important. I think, especially we as survivors who maybe we constantly had our boundaries violated, it is so hard to move into that space to say, like, this is what I want. And this isn't just what I want, it's what I deserve. And this is what, if you want to be my lover, gotta respect boundaries, right? So it's like, sorry, y'all, this is just, I sing a lot more in the pandemic, and I apologize. It's that queer thing. Anywho, so say that to say, though, right? Like, it's so important. Like, why would you stay with someone who doesn't respect your boundaries? Why go out on that second date with that person who isn't willing to respect small boundaries? And even just thinking about the reality that, like, when we have big boundaries that get violated, oftentimes there were smaller boundaries that were crossed along the way. And so it's even those little boundaries can kind of give us like a temperature check on how the relationship is going. And it's so important to find those people that are willing to lean in and say, like, you know what? I care more about you than I care about my want in this moment. I care more about you feeling safe. So yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. What about you, Finn? I promise I won't sing as much or dance as much. Maybe. Maybe.
I honestly feel like any meeting or event with you without your wonderful singing isn't complete. So anything.
All right. Good. I'm glad we checked that box. So we might get another one later, but yeah.
Lovely. Yeah, I'm super with you, Sabrina, on like the music, and just being creative in general is super helpful for me. And also I found to be super accessible in almost any solution, because as Kay just proved, with nothing, we can still sing. So for me, being creative, like especially playing guitar, for me has been super helpful. Like I find it really hard to focus on literally anything else while I'm playing guitar. But things like that, being creative, and also being in community, being surrounded by people who respect boundaries and care about me and are there to listen to what I might need in any given scenario. Like my close friends, know like, hey, if Finn's having a flashback, put a wet towel on the back of his neck and he'll be good. Like just like the little things that, like, having people that care enough to learn those little things has been super important. So yeah, I think little things and finding joy in, for example, like just hanging out with my dog and like being in the present with little moments like that has been super important for me.
Oh, I love that both of you are bringing up this piece about like the joy component, because I think especially as survivors, right? Like back to that, like healing is not linear, right? The journey is not all good. It's not all bad. Our process here is to move from a space of seeing things in black and white to seeing all of the shades in between, right? Like we are literally the rainbow community. And so it's so important for us to be able to move into those spaces, right? Where we can like, I'm going to take 30 minutes to just listen to, like, you know, the other day I was like, screw it, I'm going to get off work on time on a Friday and I'm going to watch Charlie XCX do a live stream because she's one of my favorite artists. So just like we danced in our living room, we had a good time, right? But it's like those things about like being intentional and saying, I'm going to choose to engage in joy or calm or peace right now, because we do have a choice oftentimes to decide kind of what we water, what we pay attention to always grows. Sabrina and I are spending a lot of time using some community resiliency model language. So if you're interested in learning more about that, you can contact CCS at the website that was listed below, or you can contact North County Lifeline at nclifeline.org. But so I say that to say, I really appreciate that because it's about that journey, right? It's about not the end result, but what we're experiencing in the moment and what we find along the way. So I really, really appreciate you sharing that. And dang, I wish I had friends like you when I was your age, Finn. Man, so many of my flashbacks would have gone so much better. That would have been so great. Appreciate that. So thinking about like survivors, and I know I've felt this before too, but a lot of times survivors experience feelings of like self-blame or self-judgment even about what they've experienced. So what are some ways that maybe you or survivors can overcome these thoughts on their own or with the help of others? What have you found to be helpful?
Yeah, I can start. Okay, so for me, it's definitely taken a lot of therapy, to be completely honest, and it's still something I struggle with, and still something that I have to like really intentionally rework my thoughts around. But it's I don't even know how to like it's such like a deep seated thing, especially like in society, of like victim blaming is so huge, and so like seeing it from everywhere and then getting it the worst from yourself is super hard. But I found that having just validation, even from like one person, you know, of like just like running through everything with one person and them being like, okay, dude, like this was not your fault, you know, like having just like one person even is super helpful. And then like starting to be able to be that person for yourself after that gets a lot easier. And yeah, I don't know. It's really hard, to be completely honest with you. It's not an easy thing to get through, but being able to kind of catch yourself when you have those thoughts and be like, hey, whoa, like the only person who causes abuse is an abuser. You know, like there's nothing that you could have done differently to stop that. That was their choice, not yours. So being able to like be that person for yourself, I think has been super helpful.
Oh, Finn, that was such a fantastic. I don't, and I agree. Like, I don't know that there's any like one right or wrong answer, but I think that like being able to like kind of like test your reality or like check in with friends is so important to be like, hey, can I ask you something that's probably going to sound really wild for a minute? And you just tell me that that's not correct, right? Like, so like getting to that place where you even have that support to be able to say that is so important, because we spend so much time in self-judgment and blame about the things that we experienced. We internalize that so much. You know, even for myself, I know when I interact with folks who have done me harm, I still am in my 30s and I still am like, did I do that? No. Stop thinking that. You didn't do that. That person did that. That person's still doing that. And it's okay for you to hold that boundary. But it's important, you know, I don't think I could have even done that myself if I didn't have that objectivity of friends or family who are like, no, hard pass, unsubscribe from that right now. Like, what are you doing? You're living in your castle of despair again. So, well, anyway, so thank you for that, Finn. I really appreciate that. What about you, Sabrina? What have you found that it's been helpful for you, or like other ways you found that survivors kind of overcome those self-blame or self-doubt?
Yeah, so I like Finn was saying, it's not easy, right? And as healing is not linear, if you have a bad day where you're like, oh man, I thought we addressed this last week, Sabrina. I thought we came to the agreement. It wasn't our fault. It still happens, right? And so just being able to like, when those feelings come, like be able to name like, okay, this is how I'm feeling on this day, and here's what I know to be true, right? And so just practicing saying it out loud, I think has been really helpful. And the other thing that's been really helpful, I mean, like, you know, I wear these hats, right? I'm a survivor, and then I also work at a rape crisis center, and, you know, it's like my profession. And something that I think has been really helpful in my personal journey has helped me in my professional journey, in that I'm learning, you know, I've learned and I teach about consent day in and day out, right? Consent is a conversation. It is limited. It is enthusiastic. It is an active choice, and it is reversible. And when I know those things to be true, then I can look at my past experience and say, that person did not respect my consent in very clear ways. And so it's really validating to be grounded in, like, this is what consent is, and what I experienced was not respecting consent. And so therefore I'm valid, you know, that it's valid. And again, going back to what I said, like, gosh, 30 minutes ago now, was, you know, your trauma is valid, right? Whatever, regardless of what it is, what happened, not comparing it to anyone else's. Fact is, you're having trauma responses, and that means that you experienced something, and that's valid. And the other thing that I think has been really important for me to learn has been about neuroscience and brain science, and why our brains and our bodies respond to trauma the way that they do. So the quickest way I can explain it is we pretend that this is my brain, and this is like the back of my brain right here, and this is the front of my brain right here, these 4 fingers. The front of my 4 fingers, the front of my brain, is what makes me me. It's what makes me, it's what allows me to make decisions and be a logical human, and, you know, string together sentences. That's all happening in the front of my brain. And when trauma happens, you flip your lid. You don't have access to the front of your brain anymore. You're just dealing with your brainstem and your amygdala, and all that stuff is just like, stay alive. You know, something's happening right now. A tiger just walked into the room. You're like, we're responding to that. We're not stringing together logical sentences. We're not making sense of the situation. We're just trying to figure out fight, flight, freeze, tend and befriend. We're just trying to get through the moment. And that's not a conscious decision. And so it's been really important for me to learn, oh, I did that because I didn't have access to the front of my brain at that moment. I was actively in trauma, and my brain was making decisions for me on autopilot to try to keep us safe. When I look back on it, sometimes I'll cringe and be like, oh, why did I do that? I wish I didn't do that. But the reality is, we were just trying our best to stay safe however we could. And that's valid.
I love that you brought in the neuroscience piece, because I'm a huge neuroscience nerd. So I appreciate that. But also, yes, like, the way trauma responses are biological. Your body is doing that naturally. You don't have a choice. And so I think for those of you who maybe haven't had any time to explore or learn a little bit about neuroscience, I would encourage you to maybe, you know, check in with Center for Community Solutions as an example. Ask for a little bit of information about the community resiliency model or North County Lifeline to hear a little bit about how trauma affects the nervous system and ways that you can maybe help to work through that. And I'll give a little bit more of a plug later on as well, but we've been doing a lot of workshops through our LGBTQ plus survivor task force. We've been doing lots of workshops through the Me Too LGBTQ conferences that we've had in the past, as well as workshops, community workshops for providers that we're getting ready to start implementing in the next couple of months. And so I'll plug again, but if you're interested in getting involved with the Me Too LGBTQ task force, you can email the LGBTQ survivor task force. You can email metoo.lgbtq@gmail.com if you'd like more information about the work we're doing. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later on as well. But thank you both so much, because I think it's so important for us to be able to find those ways to bring in objective science, objective information, objective opinions from our friends and our family members to say, hey, it's not your fault you're having that panic attack right now, or it's not your fault that this happened or you responded in this way. I'm curious, kind of thinking about that though, and thinking about your experiences and the need for support and kind of that need for like outside validation too. How would you have liked to be supported by your friends or loved ones when you first started your healing journey versus now? Like, are they the same? Are they different? What has that felt like for you all?
I definitely think my needs have shifted since since I first started, because when I first started, I was actively in crisis. And I needed that to be validated and acknowledged. And like I mentioned earlier, the people who I first disclosed to in my life didn't have the understanding of consent or the understanding of trauma or crisis to be able to do that for me. And eventually, thankfully, I was connected to somebody who was able to validate and get me connected to resources. But at the beginning, I think I just wish that people had believed me when I said something was wrong, right? And when we train people on how to support survivors, our first things that we say are listen, validate, and empathize. And that's, just sitting with someone and asking, like, how are you? Like, how did that make you feel? Are you okay? What do you need right now? What can I do to help? And that's another thing, is what can I do to help? Not, oh, you need to do this. And that, I think, is still the same for me, because I really don't appreciate it when again, violence is often about a dynamic of power and control, where the person experiencing the violence doesn't have options or autonomy. It's really frustrating and can be extra triggering when I'm seeking support from someone and all they do is dictate how I'm supposed to move forward, even if they have the best intentions. If they say, oh, you need to just take a nap, or you need to go drink water, or you need to schedule a therapy appointment. I'm like, I was just trying to tell you how I was feeling on this Wednesday. And that could have been a different conversation if you had just asked me what I wanted to do next, as opposed to just telling me. So I think that has stayed the same. And that's kind of where I'm at now, where I just would hope, and I often do have people in my life who ask me what I need, who respect my boundaries, and who understand that I am still actively working through trauma responses, because it's not linear, and we're a few years out from my last experience with violence, and it still comes up for me day to day. So just the patience, I guess right now I'm asking for people in my life to have patience and understanding, and be questioning about how they can support.
Oh, thank you, Sabrina. I agree. First and foremost, right, it has to start for supporting those of us in our lives who have experienced sexual or relationship violence. We have to start by believing, first and foremost. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about how many people falsely report experiences of sexual and relationship violence. And I can say, as somebody who's been in this field for 10 years now and a survivor myself, I don't know anyone who would really want to pretend that this is their actual life experience, because I don't. If I could unsubscribe, I probably would, at least, from that component, So I say that to say, like, nobody, this is someone's lived experience, and this is real to them, regardless of what, the fine details may have been. This is their reality. And so we got to start by believing. And I also appreciate you mentioning, Sabrina, the piece about, like, sometimes I just need to vent. And, like, I think what I found is really important for me is, like, to be able to say, like, I need to vent, or I need advice. Like, I'm going to tell you what I need from you right now, because sometimes not everybody is able to kind of more finely distinguish that need versus, like, okay, let's jump in. Sorry. Sorry. Before we love working from home, before we jump into that problem solving component of, like, you need therapy, you need this. But another thing that also came up for me that I was hearing you say was also this component of the reality that, like, when we think about that power dynamic, right, of how abuse happens, and then we see that same power dynamic play out when you reach out for support and you're like, I need support. And then other people tell you instead, this is what you should do. This is where you should go. It puts that blame back on the survivor to be the one to fix everything, right? It's that victim blaming space of, like, you need to heal yourself, not the reality that society is just effed, right? Like, the world is a giant dumpster fire, and it's okay for me to have a bad day and not go to therapy or use a coping skill because the world is on fire, and that's fine, right? Well, it's not fine that the world's on fire, but it's okay to acknowledge that this is where we live, right? And so it's also okay to acknowledge that sometimes us telling people you need therapy, you need this, you need that, is actually us victim blaming in that moment and shifting back to that same power dynamic. So I really, really appreciate you sharing that, because I think that really highlights, again, all of the ways that our healing journey is impacted by racism, by homophobia, by biphobia, by transphobia, all of those things that kind of filter into how we support or attempt to support other people. So thank you so much, Sabrina. Finn, I'm wondering for you, how is this, kind of what did this look like for you at the beginning versus kind of where are you at now? How have you asked for support and help from loved ones?
Yeah, I think in the beginning for me, I needed a lot of kind of like gentle pushes towards support. I very much didn't like being told like what I needed, but at the same time, it took me about 9 months after the event happened to actually like process like, oh, that was trauma. That wasn't consent. Like that was like something that wasn't okay that happened. And so it took it. I had a friend, and they were like, "Have you talked to your therapist about that?" And I was like, "No, why would I? Like that's not affecting me at all." And then I very, very soon after learned that it was affecting me a lot. So I needed kind of like that gentle push, like, hey, like that happened. It's okay if you like need to talk to somebody about that. So I kind of like those gentle pushes. And then also being a youth, I didn't really want to talk to my parents about it, because that's like not necessarily the conversation I want to have with my parents. And so there was a lot of needing space. I had a meeting with both my parents and my therapist that basically went like, hey, something traumatizing happened. Don't ask me about it. And that was kind of like the line of like, hey, I'm going through something, but I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want it to be a topic of conversation or anything. And so I needed a lot of space in the beginning for sure. But then as time went on, I needed a little more of the support of like, hey, like I actually kind of do want to talk about this, and I might need support from you in this way. And I might need you to ask me if I need anything, if you see me having a bad day. In the beginning, it really looked like if you see me having a bad day, like just kind of hands off space, but that shifting has been super helpful. And then especially with like the friends around me, like I said, like being able to ask for, hey, if I'm having a flashback, can you remind me to do these things? I might not be able to ask for it in the moment, but like if people around me know, that's been super helpful. And then it's also been helpful just like being able to be in these spaces like here now, right? Like in the beginning, I was like, no, why would I want to talk about this publicly? But now like wanting kind of that, like, okay, like I feel a little better about my healing journey, and I'm a little more ready to talk about it in a way that helps others, because for my brain, it's like, oh no, like I don't want to do something that's helpful for me, but if it's going to help others, oh, might as well, and then that turns into also being super helpful for me. But if I don't think about it that way, my brain doesn't tell me I'm being selfish, so it's like those little like weird loopholes to get like support that you need without feeling weird about it, if that makes sense.
Oh, I love that so much. I think that highlights the point and a reminder, right? When we think about the idea of healing is not just individual, it is collective. And so, just a plug and a reminder, right? Like, especially throughout the pandemic, we've seen so many kind of Instagram therapists with their holistic this, that, or the other. And that's okay. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with being holistic, but just a reminder that like, when we lean into healing, it's not just about us as the individual and our boundaries. It's about us changing our community as well and healing our community. And we can't heal individually. It has to be collective. That's truly holistic healing. And so when we solely move to the space of identifying either as everything that happens in my life is a trauma response, or everything that happens in my life is individually my responsibility to fix, that's a very like colonialistic way of thinking about things. And so we have to expand to that community space, which is, I appreciate you sharing that, Finn, because that's why it's so important, right? To be able to help access healing for other people also helps us heal at the same time. That's why it's so important, right? For us to participate in, for those of us who have, various cultural identities, to practice those cultural healing spaces as well, from Indigenous spaces or from the spaces of where we come from, because that's just as important to healing. So I really appreciate you sharing that, because so many of us, myself included, started in spaces where it was like, I can help a domestic violence shelter. Yeah, I'll do that. And then coming home and being like, oh my God, what did I do to myself? What am I feeling right now? I don't like these feelings, right? So yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, because many of us find ourselves in that space too. Sabrina's like, nope, not me. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not sane. So I'm going to ask Sabrina, if I could ask you this question kind of more as a community provider and out in the spaces. we know that our bi and our pan siblings have the highest rates of sexual violence within like the entire LGBTQ plus community as a whole, unfortunately. And so I'm kind of wondering, as we think about that, and even thinking about our trans siblings, right? And especially our Black trans female siblings and the violence that they experience, especially around sexual and relationship violence. Why do you think it's important for providers and the community to like know more about general statistics and know about like how sexual and relationship violence impacts the queer community?
So I think this question is so interesting because as an educator, my least favorite slides and like the slides that I spend the least amount of time on are the statistics slides. And it's because unfortunately, they're really only there to get people on board with understanding the fact that, yeah, your practice should be inclusive to the LGBTQIA plus community. It not just it should, it has to be. Otherwise, you're not doing the work. You're just perpetuating the systems that lead to these disparate rates. And so, and I appreciate you bringing up that, you know, intersecting identities intersect and they compound, and that leads to increased barriers to accessing services, in addition to increased experiences of violence. So not only are our communities experiencing higher rates of violence, but they're also experiencing higher literally higher barriers to accessing the services of care that they might want. So I think knowing the stats are important, in that it's important to be able to understand how individual experiences of violence are informed by these systems of oppression, right? Because the reason why, my understanding of why, you know, different communities are statistically higher, or how do words work? You know, certain communities have been like, I don't know. But the reason why certain communities experience higher rates of violence is because of, you know, historic and systemic marginalization and oppression, and that's just replicated in our individual experiences of violence. And I think that's super important to know and name, because especially since sexual violence and relationship violence for kind of the history of forever have been treated as, oh, that's an individual thing that you should really deal with on your own. Like, don't bring it here. We don't want to know about it. Keep it like locked away. Don't want to know about it. And that's, you know, when we're talking about how violence is a community experience and healing is a community experience, you know, we got to name that, and we got to look beyond. So stats are important, but more important is that you shore up your services to meet the needs of people who need services.
Amen. One more time for all the people in the back. Yes, right. Like stats are important to show that this is a thing. If you want to see the research, we can show you the research. And the reality is, you've been working with queer folk. You just didn't know it because you weren't a safe provider for them to come forward and disclose. So this is so important, especially for our bi and our pan siblings who kind of, in some ways, they kind of hide in plain sight, right? Like they don't necessarily are not always, you know, huge and visible in the queer spaces and queer community. Like that's still very much a part of their identities. And it's so important for us to address those components. So I really appreciate that. So I have one last question for you all before we end today, as we're coming to time. I know that, we've kind of talked a little bit about the LGBTQ Survivor Task Force here and there, and you're both members of the task force, myself as well. And we've done, we've talked a little bit about, we've done the Me Too LGBTQ conference where we were able to talk about sexual and relationship violence specifically within the queer community and how that impacts individuals in that intersection, and other programming that we've done and we're getting ready to do. But I'm curious for you all, how has being involved in part of that work helped you with your healing process? So yeah, if you could share a little bit about that, what that's been like for you.
I can start on that. So for me, being a part of the task force has been huge because, like, honestly, being able to create a space that I wish I had, especially in the beginning of my healing, and being involved with the youth track, right? Like at our conference last year, watching and like working with Sabrina, and we had this workshop that had to do, we had Ginny, I don't remember what organization Ginny works with, but she did a
Glisten.
yes,
Yeah.
with Glisten. Ginny with Glisten, absolutely amazing. She did a workshop just basically using art for healing and like watching youth who had like severe trauma, right? Like going and learning how to use art as a way to heal their trauma, and like me sitting there and like also learning and like being a youth and like, wait, like I can use art for healing with like my trauma, and just like, I don't know, just being able to create a space like that has been super healing, and to see it develop and be a part of all of these meetings has been awesome, honestly.
Thank you, Finn. I appreciate that so much. What about you, Sabrina?
I don't know if I have anything to add. It's just, it's that same thing, right? Like when you take action and you are, it's such a relief after spending so much time not knowing what to do with your hands. I've been holding this trauma for how many years, and I've just been holding it. And so it's such a relief to just stretch those muscles in a different way with people who understand that experience. Even if they haven't lived it themselves, they're here to show up and support, and you get to create something. You get to like be in community with people in a space that you helped design. And that in itself is healing.
Yes, I love that. And I think what's coming to mind for me is the reality that, and I think about even my own work within the task force, is that when we think about trauma at the heart of itself, right? Trauma, especially when we're talking about sexual and relationship violence, it impacts how we connect with each other, how we communicate with each other, how we have relationship with each other. And so part of that healing process is finding those spaces to re-engage in healthy relationships or relearn. And I think for me, coming into the task force, especially, like I've learned so much from both of you in different ways through different things, because no one of us is an expert in every single thing related to violence and the queer community, right? Like we all have things to learn. But I think also that space of being able to connect with each other and say like, wow, that person has a similar experience or a different experience, but it's so important for me to know that because it helps me and my friends heal as well. And so I think that has been such a, for me as well, like a really big part of that community space, to be able to engage with other survivors and create a space that is safe, create a space that is accepting, and create a space that, exactly like what Finn said, like to have that space where we as like queer youth could have been like, oh man, I would have loved that for myself as a teenager. And so, yeah, I think one of the, again, so I want to highlight a couple of things. Thank you both so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I do want to highlight a couple of things again for everyone as a reminder that if you're interested in getting involved in the LGBTQ Survivor Task Force, you can email me to lgbtq@gmail.com to learn more about our programming, to learn more about our meetings and the things that we are putting on together. This event in particular came out of our task force as a desire to talk about sexual and relationship violence during Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So we really appreciate you both. And I did see a question kind of thinking about connecting and relating through trauma. And I would say, kind of based on the conversation that was had in the chat, in the comment section, to consider maybe seeking some professional support around the process of the connection that you have with your partner currently. I think there's a lot of work to be done in exploring how queer folk have sexual relationships differently than other people, and how sometimes our trauma experiences can impact that as well. And we can heal through sexual relationships in our trauma, but sometimes that requires the help and support of a professional individual, or maybe even a support group. So I would consider reaching out to Center for Community Solutions or other spaces just like that. And if not, you can reach out to Center for Community Solutions, and they always are fantastic about referring people to other resources as well throughout the community that might be more appropriate for you. So I would consider those components. But I do just want to say thank you so much to our fantastic panelists today. We would not have been able to do this without you. This conversation was fantastic, and I really appreciate your vulnerability in just sharing your experiences and what you've gone through. So thank you so much. We'll say we've reached the end of this event, and I want to thank our panelists again for joining us and sharing with our LGBTQ plus community today in San Diego and across the nation. So as we're wrapping up, I'd like to thank the LGBTQ Survivor Task Force for helping plan this program. Again, if you're interested in joining the LGBTQ Survivor Task Force, you can email me to lgbtq@gmail.com for more information. And remember to tune in for our next virtual event, Vibe with Pride, vibin' on April 15th, Tax Day. If you enjoyed this panel today, we want to know if you enjoyed it. Tell us. And if you'd like to see more programs like this, please visit SD Pride /donate to make a donation to maybe create more programs just like this. And last but not least, I want to thank you all for tuning in and spending your lunch hour with us and our wonderful panelists. Thank you so much. And I hope you all have a great rest of the day. Goodbye.